the second inaugural address my take on it was that it had more of a vibe of a State of the Union address than an inaugural address, I think in part because it was indoors. And that made it sort of feel like he was addressing a joint session of Congress, even though he wasn't, even though this was an inaugural address. President Trump spoke in his sort of trademark low monotone, gave his list of grievances. Among his grievances this time was an assertion that there was not even a token effort made to fight the Los Angeles fires, which was a very unusual assertion. If this inaugural address is remembered, I think, as a signal of what's to come, it may be the part where he said, "We're taking it back," when talking about the Panama Canal. He pledged to be a president of peace and to not start any new wars, but did also pledge to forcibly take another country's territory. While President Trump was speaking, a relatively large group of Proud Boys, the pro-Trump armed paramilitary group, marched in full colors in their trademark black and gold in downtown Washington to the Capital One Arena. Just before the inaugural address, just before the swearing in, outgoing President Biden issued pardons to members of his family, noting that while they had done nothing wrong, he believed the threats and promises of politicized persecution of people who the new president has decided are his enemies warranted what President Biden would have otherwise never considered doing. Nicole?
Let me do three things. I mean, we lost Cecile Richards today. She lost her battle with an aggressive form of cancer. And this statement came out as I was starting to sort of take notes on the speech. Her family quoted her and said, if you'd like to celebrate Cecile today, we invite you to put on some New Orleans jazz, gather with friends and family over a good meal, and remember something she said a lot over the last year. It's not hard to imagine future generations one day asking, quote, when there was so much at stake for our country, what did you do? The only acceptable answer is everything we could. If that moves you in any way, we now know where help might be needed. Trump had the most detailed policy announcements on the border. I'm actually going to quote one more person here. Katie Rogers of the New York Times tweeted this as that section ticked through, quote, as Trump disparages migrants as criminals and outlines his plans, there are not millions and millions of criminal aliens, as he claims today. A largely white crowd is applauding in the rotunda. So these are the specifics and the atmospherics as outlined by the New York Times in the room. Trump's actions today include declaring a national emergency at the southern border. As far as we know, the latest reporting is that there isn't one at the southern border. Some of the crossings are at the lowest they've been in 2 administrations. He announced that troops will be sent to the southern border and a designation of cartels as, quote, foreign terrorists. He also invoked the Alien Enemies Act and said it'll be used to target gangs. The swirl of activity today is the point. The specific policies that we can focus on and drill down on, again, one way to respond to what was really an Earth 2 address, described the country as a catastrophic disaster, a hellscape. There is an audience for that. There are people that believe that. But again, we do have now some more information on where the earliest policy directions will have the federal government pointing.
Jen?
I know we're not living in normal times, as we've been discussing for 3 hours, but I think it's important to remind everybody that in normal times, the inaugural address is actually not political at all. I mean, it is the result of a political outcome of an election, but it is typically a president of either party discussing where the country is now and where it needs to go moving forward. It doesn't mean you're not discussing challenges. That's a part of it. You're discussing opportunities. But what struck me about this address was it was not just politicized. It was very personal. And there were a couple of things that I highlighted for myself. I mean, when he said, I've been tested and challenged more than any president in our 250-year history, and I've learned a lot along the way. I think we would all disagree with that characterization with this we're discussing. I was saved by God to make America great again. Never again will immense power of the state be weaponized to persecute political opponents, something I know something about. Typically, a president is not discussing themselves, even though they won. The country elected them. They are discussing the country they are about to govern. And that struck me. The last thing I would say, just to build off of what Nicole said, is Of course, there are always crises going on in the country. The border is broken. It has been broken for some time. But border apprehensions are down. He talked about crime. Crime in major cities is down. He also talked about oil production. The climate is in crisis. Meanwhile, the country, the United States, produced the largest amount of crude oil than any other country in the world last year. So that also struck me as him projecting upon us crises that are maybe not the right definition of the crises we're actually facing.
It is remarkable that he said in his inaugural address, as part of what appeared to be his prepared remarks, that I was saved by God, not talking about personal redemption in terms of his religious experience as a private individual, but rather saying that God saved him in order to make him president again. And you heard the whoops of response in the room, which gives a sort of imperative to claim that God sent you, is something that we don't expect in political life. We expect it in other parts of life, maybe, but it's going to give an unusual imperative to some of the most extreme things that he wants to do if past campaign promises and the like are anything to go by. Chris?
Yeah, the point that Jem was just making there, I mean, I remember being on that stage right next to President Barack Obama during that very, very cold morning. And the two inaugurations of Barack Obama and Joe Biden happened at moments of palpable, ubiquitous and severe crisis. The worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, the worst pandemic in 100 years. I mean, thousands of Americans dying by the day. America not knowing whether the entire economic system and foundation was going to erode beneath them. Compare that to the two times Donald Trump has been inaugurated in which those crises were not there. There was not the same acute sense of crisis. And yet the theme in both of them and the obsession of Trump's rhetoric is always a theme of national decline and national humiliation. And there's something strange about hearing it the second time. Of course, the first one was the American carnage. It's a little like a cult leader who keeps predicting different days for the end of the world. Mm-hmm. Because it's kind of like, okay, the first time you did this, we've had all these corrupt, terrible elites, and they've taken, I'm here as your retribution, I'm going to make America great again. And then it's like, well, you tried that once. I mean, the degree to which the first term has been just completely taken away from everyone's memory, how he kind of ran as a person who never actually held office before in this campaign, and to hear a very similar thematic speech that promises just around the corner, on the other side, that's when the next end of the world comes. That's when the next time we are bathed in holy light. That's the next time when everything turns around permanently for the United States. When we heard exactly that on January 2017 and he had a run at it, there is something very strange about hearing that kind of vision and prediction a second time, like the cult leader taking a mulligan and telling you paradise is around the corner again.
Democratic Senate Leader Chuck Schumer winning the Headwear Fashion Alert prize thus far of the day in his Smurf cap. Lawrence.
So in Donald Trump's lifetime, the inaugural address has gone from a president saying, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, to drill, baby, drill. And it was Donald Trump who supplied the second one. I want to do two quick fact checks on this and then to a larger point. Well, one thing, we will send astronauts to Mars. That's not going to happen during Donald Trump's lifetime, so don't expect it during his 4 years. He said we will tariff and tax other countries. If any country in the world could tax another country, that country would do it, and the people living in that country would pay no taxes. There is no such thing as taxing other countries. He will use tariffs, and tariffs do equate to taxes, and that tax will be paid only by us, by Americans. And then on the LA fires, he referred to his billionaire friends in the room and said, some of them with Los Angeles homes, he said, they don't have a home any longer. That is a lie, and it is not common for presidents to tell lies in an inaugural address. In fact, I've never heard one other than in a Trump inaugural address. Jeff Bezos' house in Los Angeles was never threatened for a single moment by that fire. The most important thing, though, was at the very beginning of his speech, because the substance of a Trump speech is always the same. This was a rally. And he began the speech the way these speeches always begin, by addressing directly the former presidents in the room. He said, President Bush, President Clinton, President Obama, President Biden. Donald Trump is the only former president who has never attended that moment so that he could have been addressed 4 years ago as a former president. And so we have returned to normalcy in that recitation, and the normalcy was presented by Donald Trump, who was in the process highlighting his own violation of that protocol, that responsibility, and that duty as an outgoing president to welcome in the incoming president.
Regardless of what happens with executive actions and with people stepping in to assume control of government departments, this inaugural address goes down in history now as the second inaugural of Donald Trump. Joy, you were watching that along with us. Wanted to get your take on both what we are seeing here now as President Biden takes off to become former President Biden, and as we absorb that address.
Well, I think to echo Lawrence, one of the things that is remarkable is that this is the thing that didn't happen when President Biden was inaugurated. Donald Trump essentially boycotted the inaugural and treated it as essentially an insult to him because he was still claiming that he had won the election. The last time we saw Donald Trump give an inaugural address, it was American carnage. And, I think to Chris's point, he did return to the notion that only his presence makes America great. What makes America great is that he is in running it. He's in charge of it. A few of the things that I will notice, but before I note that, I do have to note, just based on my text messages, Lorenzo Sewell, the Detroit pastor, his speech was quite over the top, quite performative. He is, for those who are asking, and including those who are texting me and asking who he is the Detroit area pastor who held a rally, an event for Donald Trump during the campaign, at which it was reported as a black church, and many of the members are African American. But that day, the audience inside of the church were white MAGA supporters who had been in a rally nearby. But the last things I'll say is it was a speech that was quite over the top, and I'm not sure what the point was, other than he is becoming quite famous in MAGA world. Donald Trump, in this address, declared himself to be a peacemaker and a unifier not long after declaring that he would end diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of government, rename the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, and slight indigenous Americans by returning Mount Denali, which is the indigenous name, to again be called Mount McKinley, McKinley being someone who believed in something that Donald Trump repurposed for himself, manifest destiny, which is one of the most racist concepts in the history of America. It was the empire and colonization principle that America had a right and, in fact, a duty to colonize and take over non-white places in the world and own them. And he made that direct threat against the nation of Panama, which owns the Panama Canal. And he made sure that he included a slight to the late Jimmy Carter for having made the deal to return the canal to the government who owns it, Panama. So not sure that peacemaker and unifier was much evidenced in the words that he said. But he's president again. There you go.